Now, as you just heard, some people are questioning the rationale behind the decision to close schools and the science and modeling data that backs this decision. Some critics say the decision itself was made to please unions but comes at the cost of pupils. Let's rope in the Director General of the Basic Education Department now. That's Mathanzima Mweli. Mr. Mweli, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM report. So perhaps let's start there with the immediate reaction to the President's announcement yesterday, particularly from unions, and I'm sure as you've just heard from the DA itself, many asking for this rationale behind, especially the decision to also allow grade 12s and grade 7s to be back after a short period of time. Take us through the science and the modeling that's backed this.
Well, let me first say, if we have a world view, this has happened in other countries. South Korea had to close at some point. The same applies to China and other countries after they reopened schools under COVID-19. So it's not peculiar to South Africa. It has happened elsewhere. It's going to continue to happen even here, informed by what we call realities. And that's what actually informed this decision. There are increasing infections in communities. Communities are taking a lot of strain. There's an increased psychological and emotional stress. The health system has been overstretched in some parts of the country. I can cite Eastern Cape, which we all know, even KZN, and even other provinces. And that's the rationale. These are the variables that inform the decision eventually. And schools are located in communities, and some of the schools also indicated some strain. And there was a need to consider a break, to deal with some of these things, to make sure that the health system is up to it. Also from our side, we're able to support schools better, but also deal with some of the challenges that make it difficult for schools to cope with the emerging realities of the increased infection.
Sure. If there's stress and strain on the system in and of itself, why bring matrics back literally just after a week and grade 7 pupils a week after that?
It's called a differentiated adjusted approach, which is also used all over the world. As the President explained yesterday, we're taking measured decisions to make sure that the health considerations are at the uppermost of our minds. And therefore, that's why you don't bring all learners. You bring fewer learners who are much more matured, who are likely to cope with the challenge that is presenting itself, the reality that's beginning to emerge.
I guess what's been pointed out here, Mr. Mweli, is the fact that a week doesn't really change much. What's your perception insofar as that critique is concerned, especially for matrics?
Well, in terms of health considerations, if we talk about health considerations, it does. The risk is managed better if you bring fewer senior, much more matured learners as compared to all of them at once. But in terms of the grade 12 learners academic program, it's just a break. You're affording them. There's been a lot of tension, increased psychological and emotional stress on both learners and educators. And we believe that a week will make a huge difference to grade 12 learners because they've also been subjected to the same stress and environment that all of us are going through.
All right. Another issue that certainly caught attention is the decision to only keep public school-going pupils at home and not those who attend private schools. And a point made by the Gauteng Education MEC, that's Panyaza Lisufi, I think through his Twitter yesterday, said all learners, in fact, eventually attend the same universities and tertiary institutions, irrespective of whether or not they come from IEB or the NSC system. So on the face of it, it certainly appears that this is a decision that's likely to exacerbate the already existing inequalities in our education system. What's your response to that critique?
No, maybe we've forgotten that the academic year of public schools vis-a-vis private schools are managed differently. They've never been managed the same. Even school holidays, intervals are different. They've never been the same. Independent schools have just been on a break of 2 weeks. What would be the reason really to say to them, go another break? And as I said, the academic years vary in terms of how they are structured. They are on a trimester system. We are on a 4-quarter system. Those are 2 different academic years. Even if you announce breaks, you take that into account, which is exactly what the president has done.
But Mr. Mweli, are you then able to confidently say that even despite this differentiation, the amount of contact learning for private and public school-going pupils is going to be the same?
Well, I can't say that. Private
so
schools
what's the point of pointing out what you've just pointed out then?
Yes, private schools are more endowed. If you talk about success of virtual learning, online learning, they're doing much better than us in terms of penetration and access because of the well-to-do families that are taking their children there. It's the reality that we have as a country. But in terms of public schools, although we're providing online and virtual learning, which we started doing during lockdown, our penetration and access is much less compared to private schools. But you also need to appreciate you've got 23,400 public schools and you've got 1,600 private schools. So private schools are a very small component of the entire system, even if you compare with public schooling. In fact, some people are saying, you can't even compare the two, given the numbers.
Let me ask it this way. Are you worried about what this will do to the quality of education that particularly public school pupils will now be subjected to because of this differentiation?
Well, we've been part of the consultation process with a myriad of stakeholders in basic education. And at the uppermost of our minds, we've been preparing ourselves for this eventuality because it's been coming like we did before. We have to do our best to make sure that our young people are supported and they succeed like we've done it before. The minister is meeting with all district directors at 9 o'clock this morning as part of that effort to say that no child must be left behind. We have to make sure that they are fully supported and they succeed. Like all other learners, whether private or public, like all other learners throughout the world. We are going to do our best to make sure that they are fully supported.
Very quickly, DG, when schools were opened, even during this lockdown period, how many pupils actually were attending contact classes? Those, of course, who could. Are you happy with the attendance rate that we've been able to see during this pandemic?
I'm extremely happy. The first point is that we've been benchmarking internationally as to how are we comparing with the rest of the world in terms of the teacher attendance rate, learner attendance rate. Teacher attendance rate is above 90%. Learner attendance rate up to before last week, it was over 80%. It went down last week because of inclement weather in the Eastern Cape and Western Cape, where there were winds that were blowing and the weather changed quite drastically. It was very bad in those parts of the country. And as a result of that, it impacted negatively on the attendance rate of learners. Under the new normal, under COVID-19, our attendance looked quite good compared to other countries.
All right. You mentioned the Western Cape. I've already alluded to a tweet from Bangaza Lesotho, who's the Gauteng Education MEC. Debbie Schaefer, who's his counterpart in the Western Cape, also sent out a tweet hot on the heels of the president's address. She said, don't tell me what to do. Now, it's quite coded, and I won't ask you to, explain what she meant by that, but I guess the pressing question becomes, are provincial education departments able to break ranks from the president's address and, do what they feel is best at the time?
Well, I'm a public servant, and the best way to deal with this is to refer it to the minister, who's a public representative, to respond to a matter that has been raised by a public representative. What I can tell you as the head of the Secretariat of the Council of Education Ministers is that this matter was extensively discussed there. There was no impression by any of the 9 provinces that they were not happy with what was likely to happen. And therefore, the Western Cape was part of those discussions. They might have indicated their differences in terms of how they view things, but eventually the entire Council of Education Ministers accepted the notion of a break.
So you're not expecting anybody essentially to push back against this decision. That's what you're saying.
I would be surprised if it happens.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Certainly appreciate it. No doubt you're quite a busy man at this moment. That's Mathanzima Mweli, who's the Director General of the Basic Education Department.